Take your Bibles, if you would, turn to the book of Genesis, chapter number 18. Genesis, chapter number 18. The title of the message is, For Ten's Sake. For ten's sake. T-E-N, the number, for the lack of 10. Genesis, chapter 18. Start reading with me at verse number 23. Genesis 18:23 says, And Abraham drew near and said, Wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Peradventure there be 50 righteous within the city. Wilt thou also destroy and not spare the place for the 50 righteous that are therein? That be far from thee to do after this manner, to slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked. That be far from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And the Lord said, If I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. And Abraham answered and said, Behold, now I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord, which am but dust and ashes. Peradventure there shall lack 5 of the 50 righteous. Wilt thou destroy all the city for the lack of 5? And he said, If I find there 40 and 5, I will not destroy it. And he spake unto him yet again, and said, Peradventure there shall be 40 found there. And he said, I will not do it for 40's sake. And he said unto him, O let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Peradventure there shall 30 be found there. And he said, I will not do it if I find 30 there. And he said, Behold, now I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord. Peradventure there shall be 20 found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 20's sake. And he said, O let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak yet but this once. Peradventure there shall be found there. Peradventure 10 shall be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 10's sake. And the Lord went his way as soon as he had left communing with Abraham, and Abraham returned unto his place. We're jumping in at the middle of a story here, the middle of an account. It actually might sound a little bit like a bargaining is going on, but what's taking place is that Abraham and the Lord Himself are communicating and deciding the future of a city, called Sodom. It's not a bartering that's taking place, it's actually a pleading for mercy. The Bible doesn't tell us how large the city of Sodom and its sister city Gomorrah were. Apparently they were large cities. The Bible indicates that Lot sat in the gate of the city, which would imply that there was some type of a fort around it, some type of structure around it, indicating that possibly thousands of men and women and children lived inside this combination city, this joint city called Sodom and Gomorrah. But as Abraham knew the mind of God and knew that God was headed to this wicked city to examine it and thus to judge it if wickedness was found within it, he, out of heart's mercy, began to plead for the Lord to be compassionate to that city. He started with a fair number. In a city with hundreds, a city with thousands, certainly we could find at least 50 there in that city that would be righteous. But after Abraham had asked God for the mercy if 50 could be found, something moved inside of his heart that perhaps there would not be 50 found. And so he asked again, Lord, well, suppose 45 were in the city. And after securing that number for the grounds of mercy for the city, he asked again, suppose 40, suppose 30, suppose 20. Lord, suppose just 10 could be found. And God's mercy overflowed time after time. And God actually commissioned that if but 10 righteous people in this city of potentially thousands could be found, He would spare the entire city for the sake of those 10. You would think out of a city with hundreds, a city with thousands, 10 righteous could be found. I say 10 righteous, not necessarily 10 religious. I don't doubt in my mind that there were 10 religious inside that city. 10 out of this great host of people who probably thought of themselves as having some type of goodness within them, some type of relationship with God within them. Yet we find pretty important to this story is it's not what men think about their relationship with God that counts. It's what God thinks about their relationship with Him that counts. And so what we have is an account of Abraham beseeching God for mercy for the sake of 10. The title of the message is, For 10's Sake. 3 questions I want to ask you this morning. I think most of you know how this story will end, but if not, stay tuned. I'll share with you as I go through the message. But 3 questions I would ask with you this morning. Number 1, why weren't there 10 righteous found within this city? Why weren't there 10 righteous found within this city? Again, we don't know how large the city is. To be honest with you, there is no archaeological evidence that the place Sodom and Gomorrah existed or ever did exist. I think the reason there is no evidence is because God so thoroughly destroyed it that there is no remnant of it at all left. And yet the Bible would indicate again that it's a fairly large city, large enough to need a fort around it, large enough to be combined with another locality so that these 2 cities no doubt hosted many inhabitants, and yet 10 righteous could not be found within it. The question, why not? Why were there not 10 that were right with God within this city? I ask that question not simply to throw a stone towards the past, to ask that question for nothing more than just placing blame would be futile. But I ask that question because I believe maybe we can learn something that might help us in this day and in this age. If this city could exist without 10 righteous, who was responsible? Is it possible that it might help us to learn that answer so that we would not relive the pages of this history once again? Who was responsible? Give you an answer twofold. Number 1, the men of that city were responsible. Quite often, we as men come to appreciate the fact that God has given to us authority. We are the ones that God has designated to be the leaders of our homes, of our communities, of our nations, and of our cities. Yet with that responsibility or that privilege comes enormous responsibility. The men of that city were responsible that not 10 could be found that were righteous. In particular, I would have to say that Lot was largely responsible. The Bible speaks of him in the New Testament, in the book of 2 Peter chapter 2, verse number 7. Listen to what Peter wrote about him. It says, And delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among them, in seeing and hearing, vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds. Now, this is Peter. Peter writing commentary about the story that we're reading about in Genesis. And he calls this man, Lot, both righteous and just. Indeed, he used the term just to describe him twice, meaning he was a man who knew who God was, who was right with God, and yet that verse also describes that on a daily basis he vexed his righteous soul. His righteousness was tormented living in that wicked place that he lived. Why do you suppose righteous Lot had a vexed soul? I think it was because righteous Lot was a compromising man. Now, the word compromise is not always a bad word. Some people in some professions have to compromise. Husbands and wives have to compromise. As we deal with co-workers, we have to compromise. Just driving down the highway, in order for us to get by and to drive, we must make compromises. But when it comes to a righteous life, there's really not much room for this word compromise. Let me give you a definition of compromise. To compromise means to sacrifice your beliefs or your behaviors for the acceptance of the world. Let me say that again. To compromise, speaking of biblical compromise, it is to sacrifice your beliefs or your behaviors so that you can be accepted by the world. Lot had compromised his righteousness. He was a righteous, just man, but in order to be accepted by the people, he had sacrificed his righteous behaviors and his righteous beliefs. I believe there's several things that Abraham did that represent the compromised life. Number 1, he was either living in the wrong place or he was living in the right place the wrong way. You understand as Christians, there's some places that Christians just ought not go. There's certain things that Christians just ought not do. Unless we have been sent to those places and into those situations to be a witness for the Lord Jesus Christ. I hope we as believers understand that God doesn't have tourists on His payroll. God does not have churches full of sightseers. We are not just opportunists traveling through this world. Everyone who is a believer in Jesus Christ now is called to be an ambassador for Jesus Christ. I love that verse that Jesus gave in the book of Matthew chapter 5, verse number 13, where He describes us as not just being a part of this world, but being the salt of this earth. He says, "Ye are the salt of the earth, but if the salt hath lost his savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is thenceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out and to be trodden under the foot of man." God leaves Christians upon this world that we might be its preservative, that we might be its salt, that we might be its light. I don't know whether God intended for for Lot to live in Sodom or not, but if He did intend for him to live in Sodom, He intended him to be salt for Sodom. He intended him to be a preservative, a witness against the sins of that city. The story itself bears record that Lot lived in the city, but he lived in that city in silence. You've got your Bibles. Look over at Genesis chapter 19. We see the bargaining or the pleading take place in Matthew chapter number 18. In Genesis chapter 18. But in Genesis chapter 19, we see the judgment actually take place. Look at verse number 6. It says, "And Lot went out at the door unto them, and shut the door after them, and said, I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. Behold, now I have 2 daughters, which have not known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and do you to them as is good in your eyes. Only unto these men do nothing. For therefore came they under the shadow of my roof. And they said, Stand back. And they said again, This one fellow came in to sojourn, and he will needs be a judge. Now will we deal worse with thee than with them. And they pressed sore upon the man, even Lot, and came near to break the door." This was one time when Lot actually stood up and said something. You can tell by the way this conversation went that this city was not used to being rebuked for their sin. Here is Lot has brought in these angels of the Lord who have come to examine the city and to give them shelter for the night. This perverse group of homosexuals has come to take these men and to do evil things with them. And Lot comes out to reason with them. He comes out to try to stop them. But the reaction of the city demonstrates Lot's not normally done this. Lot's not normally spoken against the evil. Lot's not normally been one whose voice would be the voice to represent God. No, Lot had lived in that city. But Lot had not stood for God in that city. And because Lot had lived the compromising life, that city was lost for 10's sake. I understand the difficulty with being a righteous soul in an ungodly world. The world that we have lived in has changed around us dramatically in the last few years, and it's going to change all the more. And yet, if the voice of God's people remains silent, there will be nothing to stem the tide of evil. If we refuse to speak against the wickedness of this world, then, my friend, for the sake of 10, a city, a state, a nation might well be lost. I noticed something in one of those verses. It was something that the men said concerning Lot. When Lot actually spoke out. Look again what they said at verse number 9. Genesis 19:9. And they said, Stand back. And they said again, This one fellow came in to sojourn, and he will needs be a judge. You know what he just said, that crowd said to Lot or about Lot as he was trying to stop them from doing this wrong. You know what they just said? They said, he's trying to judge us. That man, he's telling us that what we're doing is wrong. He's judging us. He really ought not judge. Isn't it kind of interesting? This is Genesis chapter 18. This is taking us from the beginning of society, from the beginning of man's creation, just a few years from God creating Adam and Eve. And yet look at what the lost, wicked world says of the righteous when they stand to tell them that what they're doing is wrong. They're saying this man is judging us. It's kind of interesting. But when you stand today to tell folks what right is and what wrong is, you know what they often say? You're judging me. You ought not be judged. You would think after a few thousand years they could at least come up with a new charge against this, would you not? But it's kind of interesting also. They look at our words as being a condemnation of them. But their actions typically towards us are much worse than our words are towards them. In this particular Bible passage, you'll notice those wicked ones press against the door, so much so that they're about to break the door down. Now, I understand that we as Christians have to be gracious when we stand against the wickedness of this world. We must learn that we are not the Lord, but we are the Lord's messengers. There is a way to correct the wrong and to still do it with graciousness. And there's a balance there that we must find. But I want you to understand, folks, it doesn't matter how much you smile. It doesn't matter how nice you are. If you stand to represent Jesus Christ, the world is never going to like it. And yet stand we must. Gentlemen, it is our responsibility. It was Lot's responsibility. However, Lot was not the only man in that city. Again, I don't know how large the city was. In my mind, it was of thousands. Maybe it was of tens of thousands. We really don't know. And yet it was a city not filled with a man. It was a city filled with many men. Lot was a righteous man who was raised at the feet of Abraham. It wasn't his father, it was his uncle, but he knew what it was to have a godly example, to have a godly man and a godly woman who led him in paths of righteousness. And he's responsible in large measure because he compromised what he knew was right to allow an acceptance of that city on his behalf. Yet he was not the only man in that city. Every man in that city bore responsibility. Whether he had been raised in a Christian home or not a Christian home, each husband, each father, each official, each gentleman, each man is responsible. Gentlemen, we must understand the fact we are blessed by God with certain privileges because of no other reason than God created Adam first. Had he created Eve first, it might be completely reversed. But God created Adam first. And so he endowed Adam with leadership. He endowed Adam with the ability to do certain things. Yet with that great abilities came great responsibilities. And we as a nation of men are responsible for the nation that God has placed into our hands. Why were there the lacking of 10 righteous? Number one, it was because of the failing of men. But number two, it was also because of the failing of the ladies. It was because of the failing of the ladies. Now, God calls the men to be the head of the home, but God calls the ladies to be the heart of the home. Now, by that, I don't mean that ladies don't have any leadership positions inside the home at all, because they do. They lead the children. They input much of the direction of that home. And I don't mean that men don't have hearts at all, for they do, and they should love their family and their husbands. But God primarily calls the man to lead in the home in the right direction, and he primarily causes the woman to love the home in the right direction. This home of Lot's, it was made up of a man, it was made up of a woman. We don't know the woman's name, we don't know Lot's wife's name. I'll refer to her as Mrs. Lot, because that's the only name that we have. It's interesting concerning Mrs. Lot. As far as I know, the Bible never records a single word that she said. As far as I know, there's no words spoken by Mrs. Lot that are recorded in the Bible. Yet I believe we can understand a little bit about her by looking at her life. Nowadays they call that profiling. There's many television shows where they're just centered around somebody's ability to discern somebody by profiling. Now let's profile Mrs. Lot for a moment. What can we figure out about Mrs. Lot? I think a couple of things. Number one, we can look at her children and we can learn something about her. The Bible tells us in Genesis chapter 19, verse number 8, that Lot had 2 sons-in-laws and that he had 2 daughters that had not known men. Well, he's got 2 sons-in-laws, unless they really messed up in that city real bad. If he's got 2 sons-in-laws, then they had to have 2 of his daughters for wives who had no men. So apparently there were 4 daughters in this household. There were 2 that were married to those sons-in-laws, and there were 2 that had not known men. So this woman, this mother, Mrs. Lot, had a part in raising 4 daughters. We never read anything about the 2 that are married. We only know of their existence because of the reference to the sons-in-laws. But there were 2 that were virgins, had not known men, that still lived under the roof with them. The Bible will tell us in Genesis chapter 19 concerning these 2 ladies that they were somewhat conniving and manipulative. I won't take the time to read it because it's really kind of a gross section of the Scriptures, actually, where these 2 women thought that they might never have a chance to meet another man, and why they thought that I don't know, but began to have relations with their father, and actually conceived children by their father. By reading this story in the book of Genesis chapter 19, we can learn something about these 2 young ladies, these 2 young women. They were manipulative and they were cunning. Now, I don't mean to be offensive, but I've taught for years and believe it to be so because I've observed it for years, that typically when young ladies have certain behaviors, they typically pick up most of those behaviors from their mother. Just like when certain young men have certain behaviors, they typically pick those behaviors up from their father. It's not always the case. There's always a possibility of one child picking up some characteristics from a friend or from somebody else. But when you've got 2 daughters and both of the daughters are both cunning and manipulative, you can just about take that one to the bank. They picked that up from somebody very close to them. My thought is they probably picked it up from Mrs. Lot. I've often wondered, the Bible says of Lot that he was a righteous, just man who daily vexed his soul by staying in that city. I wonder what caused him to stay in that city. If he was vexed, if he was tormented by living in that place, if he was righteous and he was just, why didn't he just pack up and move? Is it possible that the reason he didn't was because there was a cunning, manipulative lady inside that home that kept him anchored to that city? I wonder if the reason why this family stayed inside this city was not because Mrs. Lot wanted them to stay inside the city. Don't know that for sure, but being a profiler, trying to discern something of this woman, I would say chances are this lady was a bit of a manipulator. I would say also of her by looking at her demise. In the book of Genesis, chapter number 19, if you know the story, you'll know that as they're being led out of the city, Mrs. Lot stops and she turns and she looks backwards. And when she does, God causes her to become a pillar of salt. Sounds like science fiction, except it's Bible, it's truth. Literally, this woman's body instantly became a solid stone pillar of salt. God judged her instantaneously. Why did God do that? Was it simply because she was curious and she turned to see what was happening to that city? I don't think so. I don't think it was curiosity that caused her to turn. I think it was love for that city that caused her to turn. I think there was a longing in her heart. I think that old saying that you can take the girl out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the girl. I think it was true of Sodom. You could take this dear lady out of Sodom, but you could not take Sodom out of this woman. And her heart looked back and longed for this city, and God looked at that as rebellion, and God judged her with a judgment. Now, wait a minute. I'm beginning to look at this woman, and I think of this woman, she loved that city and the prominence of that city more than she loved her family and the purity of those daughters. It might well be that had Lot and his wife taught that city to seek after God, that those daughters might not have become what they became. It might well be that if this husband and wife had reared their family and trained their family and loved their family more than they had loved that city and the prominence of that city, that city might not have been destroyed. Yet because of the responsibility of both this man and this woman, because of the men of that city and the woman of that city, there lacked 10 to be righteous, and all was lost. Let's do a little bit of math. Let's count up how many were in this family. The Bible tells us that Abraham began to beseech God for the number 50. He said, if we can find 50, would you spare the city? 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. Why do you suppose Abraham stopped when he got to 10? Why didn't he keep going down? Lord, if there were 5, God, if there was but 1, if there's just one righteous man inside, and he knew Lot was there, if there's just one righteous man, would you beseech them? Why did he stop at 10? Let's stop and count the family. Lot makes 1, Mrs. Lot makes 2. They got 2 sons-in-law, that makes 4. We suppose they had 2 wives, that makes 6. There's 2 daughters that haven't been married, that makes 8. The family of Lot is a total of 8. Is it possible that the reason that Abraham stopped pleading was because he thought to himself, well, surely there's 8 that are righteous down there. I mean, that's my family this time. I raised Lot. I know what kind of man he is. He's picked his own wife. They picked their own sons-in-law, but he's reared his own kids. Certainly there's at least 8, and surely those 8 would have at least tried to influence 2 others. I mean, surely there's 2 servants that live with them. Maybe there's 2 co-workers that work beside them. Maybe there's 2 neighbors that live next door to them. Maybe there's 2 friends that they go to school with. Certainly that family of 8 would have influenced at least 2. Why did the city perish for a lack of 10? It's because the men, the women, Lot, Mrs. Lot, failed to represent the Lord Jesus Christ in the midst of that evil and wicked world. Why was there a lack of 10? It was the lack of 10 because the men and the women failed. Number 2, let's consider what happens when there's a lack of 10. The Bible tells us that God would have spared the entire city had there been 10 righteous. What happens when there's a lack of 10? Number 1, when there's a lack of 10 righteous, sin spreads. Sin spreads. The story, we've only read a portion of it, but the story itself is amazing. It's amazing because it describes just how far sin spreads. Look at Genesis chapter 19, verse number 4. Genesis chapter 19, verse number 4 says, but before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young. Get this. All the people from every quarter. All the people. Now I realize sometimes when the Bible uses the word all, it doesn't literally mean every single person. But you know, I can't help but to wonder, does it mean literally every single male inside that city came out to encompass that house that night? Let's ask it the other way. Where are the counter trend? If all of these evil men have come to align themselves against Lot's house, to press against this house, to take these strangers out and to do wickedly with them, where are the decent folks? Where are the godly folks? Where are the straight folks? Where are the righteous folks? You need to understand, if the 10 are not in the city, if the righteous are not in the city, then there's nothing to stop the evil from continuing its spread. The Bible describes sin like a yeast. Once you take yeast and you put it inside the bread, it spreads. It permeates the whole loaf until eventually it fills literally every molecule of that loaf of bread. It spreads. It grows. Today we might consider it like a cancer. an evil disease which infects a clean body, a clean host. But once it's in there, if there is no righteousness, if there is no godliness, if there is no one who will use his voice, his very being to stand against sin, then sin, like a cancer, spreads throughout the entire body until it infects and destroys and kills all. And it looks to me as though this city that lacked 10 righteous people lacked it at the expense of allowing sin to permeate and spread through the entire thing. And so that God Himself was moved to eradicate this entire city off of the planet of the earth. When the righteous are quiet, sin continues its spread. It's interesting, the particular sin that this Bible passage is talking about is the sin of homosexuality. It's the sin that currently our nation is being taken over by. I've been around a little bit longer than some of you. I've seen some of the other things come into our culture that gradually overtook our culture. Now, this is the sin that is doing so. And I watched in particular over the years how this sin has been accepted by so many. The number one reason why people are accepting the sin of homosexuality, or let me say it this way, the number one cause that causes people to accept homosexuality is they've got a family member that's involved in it. I've seen it time after time after time. Somebody would say, no, that's wrong, it's sinful, we ought not do this. And then they would find out cousin so-and-so, or distant relative aunt so-and-so, or so-and-so, son or daughter involved in this. And time after time, that has caused their view of the activity to change. Now, understand something, folks. I've got some of this in my family now. I understand it like you understand it. But, folks, it doesn't matter who's involved in it. It never changes what God said about it. And I realize it puts you in a predicament of uncomfortableness. But if you stop speaking, the sin will keep spreading. You must stand for righteousness. You cannot compromise. What happens when there's a lack of the righteous? The sin spreads. Number two, the sin grows. It's not just that it spreads, entangling more folks into it, but it also grows, causing more wickedness to take place within it. Look back at Genesis chapter 19, verse number 8. This is Lot standing at this crowd that has come against his home, and he says, "Behold now, I have 2 daughters, which have not known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and do you to them as is good in your eyes. Only unto these men do nothing, for therefore came they under the shadow of my roof." Do you understand what he's doing there? Lot has 2 daughters that are yet unmarried, and he's saying, don't hurt these men. He does not realize that they're angels yet from God. He's trying to protect them. He says, don't hurt these men. Don't do this wicked deed that you're about to do. Here, take my daughters and do with them whatever seems right in your eyes. I remind you, the Bible says in the book of Peter, he is a just, righteous man. I look at this, and I'll be honest with you, if I did not have Peter telling me he was a just, righteous man, I would say he was a lost, perverted man. I remember in my younger days as a minister, I would sit under preachers, and I would hear them try to explain and justify what Lot did. They would make statements like this. They would say, well, in that day, it was such an important thing to those people to be good hosts, that they felt a great responsibility to make sure that even if they died, the guests inside their homes were well taken care of. Friend, I got news for you. I don't care what culture you're a part of. I don't care what time period you live in. You cannot begin to justify this by any stretch of the means. That was just wickedness on wickedness. Now, wait a minute. This is the best home in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, and yet Lot himself has been tainted by his compromise, so that now he does not know what right and wrong is. He is about to encourage a heinous, wicked, ungodly act. It won't happen. God won't let it happen. But he is about to encourage it. What is taking place? Listen to me. The Bible portrays homosexuality as a very serious sin. I remember in 2008, Ronnie and I were flying to Israel. First time I got to go, we didn't get to sit together. He was sitting with a Jewish man. He'd made arrangements so I could see out the window as the plane was landing in Israel. And he got to conversing with this Jewish man. And as they were talking, the Jewish man asked him, he says, "What is with you Americans? Why is it that you've picked out this thing of homosexuality and it's such a big thing?" He says, "It's just another sin." It's not just another sin. The Bible indicates throughout it that this is a precipice sin. For example, here in the book of Genesis chapter 19, God did not cause this city to be defeated because of the sin of homosexuality. He did not cause it to be captured by prisoners of war. No, He caused it by a supernatural act of God to be completely eradicated off the face of the earth. That indicates the sin that they were fooling with was a very powerful sin. It's mentioned in the book of Romans chapter 1 verse number 24. It's mentioned as one of the precipice sins. One of the sins that once it's committed, the relationship that man has with God is forfeited. That from that point on, man no longer recognizes who God is any longer. It's listed in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 6, I believe it's verses 11 and following, as one of the sins which ensures the participants will be forever damned. Folks, that's a powerful, powerful statement. In Jude chapter 1, verse number 7, the city of Sodom is used as an illustration of those who are eternally damned in the eternal fires of hell. Throughout the Bible, this particular sin is described as being a precipice sin. What does that mean? It means once you leap over this sin, once you become involved in this sin, it's very difficult to be brought back, if not impossible to be brought back to a relationship with Jesus Christ. Before a city like Sodom or a nation like the United States would ever accept this type of sin as normal behavior, almost every other sin that a man could commit would already have to be going on in that locality. Almost every other wickedness would have to be practiced. You'd have to be blaspheming God. You'd have to deny the existence of God. You'd have to come to the place where you're rebelling against the very authority of God. Or, as I said, even refusing to admit that He exists at all. You would be involved in violence. You would be involved in sexual perversion, sexual promiscuity. Every other wickedness that you could imagine would more than likely take place before a society would come to accept this kind of behavior as normal behavior. So much so that now this man who claims to be righteous is in the position of offering his virgin daughters to a bunch of wicked men that they might use them as vulgar toys and tools. And he's granting them permission. Folks, you need to understand, sin, when the righteous people aren't there, it grows in its wickedness to the place where Satan's dark dominion will cause anything and everything to be acceptable to the people that are involved in it. What happens when there are no righteous? Sin spreads. Number 2, sin grows. Number 3, God knows. Friend, you can't have sin running rampant through the streets of the city and God not know about it. Is there anything that is hid from the eyes of the Lord? If you can't hide in your heart what you think, how would you ever imagine that you could hide in your streets what you do? If sin is spreading, if sin is growing in its wickedness, you can mark her down. God knows. And if God knows, number 4, you can mark it down that God will judge. I told you I would share with you how this story ends. Look, if you would, at the book of Genesis, chapter number 19. Look at verse number 24. Genesis 19:24 says, "Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And He overthrew those cities, and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. The Bible says He rained fire and brimstone out of heaven upon that location. So much so that there is nothing, not even the blade of grass that would grow, that would be left. God destroyed it all. Is it not interesting that the terms used there are fire and brimstone, the very two terms that the New Testament describes as comprising the place called hell, the place of eternal damnation. Again, Jude 1:7 says that Sodom is an example of those which will perish in the eternal fires. Listen to me, my friend. I'm not trying to be ugly to you this morning. Don't kill the messenger. Don't hate the messenger. Listen to the messenger, because he's trying to warn you that in a world that accepts sin, when the righteous become silent and allow sin to grow, then God knows about it, and sooner or later God will judge that location. Whether it be a family, whether it be a city, whether it be a society, or whether it be a nation, God will judge. Number one, I ask, why were there not 10 righteous? Number two, I ask, what would happen if there were not 10 righteous? Number three, I ask, can we find 10 righteous? Now, this is a historical event. Genesis 18:19. We're going back towards the beginning of time. This was our history. Just to look backwards for the sake of looking backwards does no good. It's a waste of time. But to look backwards that we might change our future, oh, now it's a different ball of wax. Can we find 10 righteous? Are there 10 that are right with God? Our nation, as I have said, is making strides, but the strides that we're making are not taking us towards God, but taking us further away. Over the last few years, I've used some barometers to try to track the spiritual condition of our nation. By and large, the measures of measurement that I have selected continue to show that we're declining, not improving. 3 of the ones that I have used over the years are sex, liquor, and drugs. Sex, liquor, and drugs. Here's some statistics. These are the most recent that I could find. Let's start with a lighter topic. Let's start with the booze. In 2013, Youth Risk Behavior Survey found that among high school students during the past 30 days, just in the past 30 days, 35% had drank some amount of alcohol. 21% had binge drank. In the last 30 days throughout the nation of America, 2013, high school students, 1 out of 5 had been on a binge drink in the last 30 days. 10% drove while they were drinking alcohol, and 22% had rode with a driver who was drinking alcohol. Liquor use continues to rise in our country, even among our kids in school. How about drug use? In terms of illicit drug use, teens use marijuana the most. More high school seniors smoke pot than smoke cigarettes. As of 2015, high school seniors are about as likely to smoke weed as they are to drink. 2015, last year, high school seniors are as likely to smoke marijuana as they are to drink. Well, that means you can pretty well say the same figures are true. That would mean 35% of our high schoolers have participated in smoking marijuana in the last 30 days. 21%, 1 out of 5 of them, would be on the range of being a heavy, regular user. 10% of them would have drove while smoking weed. 22% of them would have likely have driven with somebody who was smoking weed. I'm telling you, folks, our country's not going up, our country's going down. How about sex? In 2013, 47% of our high school students reported having sexual intercourse. 47% of the kids in high school acknowledged having sexual relations. Don't you know a good host of them wouldn't have told anybody that they were doing it? What's even worse is 15% of the high school students reported already having 4 or more sexual partners. That was in the year 2013. Is our nation becoming more godly or is our nation becoming less godly? I read an article this past week. I try not to read much news anymore. It just bothers me so bad. But I heard this one on the radio and had to verify it to be true. This past week, in a 6-5 vote, Baltimore County voted not to let school out for Muslim holidays. Baltimore County voted not to let school out for Muslim holidays. Now that sounds good. The end vote, I'm glad it went that way. But the vote was 6-5. Do you realize they almost voted to let their kids celebrate Muslim holidays in Baltimore County? I'm thinking to myself, is this not the same group of folks that on 9/11 tried to destroy our nation? Is this not the same religion that has declared us to be the Satans of the world and wants to? And yet we've got entire municipalities now wanting to bring their religion into our calendar and teach our kids that. Maybe that doesn't bother you, but folks, I got news for you. That bothers me tremendously. I shared with you some months ago that New York did finally decide not to build an arch to the false god Baal. They were actually considering building a temple of Baal. You remember Baal from the Old Testament. I don't know. We talk about Baal when we read the Old Testament, but maybe you don't really understand. Baal was the god of fertility. We wouldn't say it that way anymore. We would say Baal was the sex god. In the Old Testament, Baal was this. You know what they did at the temple of Baal? They had drunken orgies where they did the most perverse and wicked things. And then when children were conceived from those acts, they would take those children and burn them alive on the altar. Somebody says, well, we don't do that anymore. Think about it for a moment. Do we not? Do we not have every weekend bars where there are drunken, wicked things taking place, where children are conceived, and maybe we don't take them and lay them on an altar and burn them anymore. No, we go to a nice, clean medical facility, and we just slice and dice them and pour acid inside the mother's womb and kill those kids. Folks, we're still doing the same things that those of the Old Testament did. We've just lost the understanding of how wicked we have become in doing these things. Could we find 10 righteous? Righteous means right with God. 10 who would stand up and still say, right is right and wrong is wrong. Could we find 10 in our church? Could we find 10 who would stand up and say, I will not be quiet any longer while wrong is done around me? Could we find 10 who would say, I will not compromise to be accepted by this world. I will not just let status quo go on. No, right is right, wrong is wrong. Could we find 10? I'll be honest, if this last political election has not destroyed your confidence in this world, I don't see anything ever moving you. I don't care what candidate gets in, folks. Neither one of them have the ability to move us in the right direction. No elected candidate does. What we need is men and women of righteousness. Somebody who will say, no, I don't care what happens to me. You're not going to do that in my home. You're not going to do that in my school. You're not going to do that in my community. You're not going to do that in my nation. Now, I'm not saying we need to arm ourselves and rebel, but my friend, we sure better start praying and fasting and getting down on our face and talking to a heavenly God, because I'm telling you, if we don't find 10 pretty soon, God Himself is going to have to destroy what was once a great and mighty nation. May 2016, for the second time, Judge Roy Moore got removed from the Chief Supreme Justice bench of the state of Alabama. I am so proud of Chief Justice Roy Moore. He was removed first, was it 2003? Removed again 2016 because he simply said, it's wrong. He says, I don't care what the federal government says. It's wrong. It's wicked. I've heard the man speak several times. He's a Christian man. removed from the bench, and I get to go to trial. Either keep his office or be removed from his office. And I'm wondering, this man is a political man. And yet it seems to me like he's got more starch, more backbone in him than 99.9% of the preachers of America. What in the world is it going to take for some people to stand up and say, no, that's not going to happen? What's it going to take for people like us to line ourselves up around our schools and say, no, you're not going to have a bathroom like that in our school? What's it going to take for us to line ourselves up around the stores and say, no, if that's the kind of store you want, you can shut her down. Nobody's going to cross this line. I'm just saying, folks, it's time for God's people to do more than sit on the pew and say that's bad. It's time for God's people to start doing some things to demonstrate God is on the throne. I got to hush. I try not to get political. My brother asked me the other day, talking about insurance and talking about it. He says, what are you going to do? I said, well, I figure I'm going to go to jail. At some point, I'm going to go to jail. He says, what's your retirement plan? Go to jail. That's it. I mean, the way this world is stacking things up, that's actually what I'm beginning to think. That's what's going to happen. But folks, if the righteous are missing, sin grows. It spreads. And God knows. And God judges. And I don't think it's ever because He wants to. I think it's because His righteousness and His holiness demands it. Let's let the people of God be the righteous people. Let's us be the 10 that make a difference. Let's pray. Father, I thank You for